So we're looking at Matthew chapter 5, verse 17. Do not think that I've come to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For assuredly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law till all is fulfilled. Whoever therefore breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches men so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Verse 20 again. For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Wow. Scribes are an interesting group as presented to us in the Scriptures. They can trace their beginning back to Nehemiah. They were the scholars. They were the ones who were given the responsibility for handling the Scriptures. And out of that, of course, came the oral traditions. And so the scribes were in charge of the application of the Scriptures and the arguments for why you should, why you shouldn't, and what you should do, what you shouldn't do, all based on the Scriptures. So whenever there was a scriptural question or a problem with the law structure, they always came to the scribe, and he would settle the matter. There were two big scribes who were scholars, who started schools, and they started prior to the day of Jesus and were continued into the day of Jesus. They were Hillel and Shammai. Those were the two big scholars, scribes. And these two guys started big schools and again had followers and students. And one was conservative, the other was liberal, so there was a constant battle on who was right and all the theological discussion that goes with that. And the scribe, of course, again, is the individual who is... there's no way to parallel him with anybody in our society because, see, the political system was all involved in this as well. So the scribe had phenomenal influence over the political system as well because he influenced those who were in charge of the politics, who were the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So the advisors to the Pharisees and to the Sadducees is the scribe, who is the authority, the last word, the bottom line on everything that's going on in the Scriptures. 57 times in the gospel accounts, the idea that the scribe is presented to us. In fact, 21 times he is associated with the chief priest, which tells you the chief priest is like kind of the president of the United States. It's that kind of a deal. So that really ties him in tight, as he's tied with the chief priest. And you will find out that 18 times, as in our passage, he's linked with the Pharisee, who again is a part of the political structure of everything that's going on in Israel. So whenever you wanted to get anything done, you went to the scribe, who would then in turn interpret the Scripture the way you wanted it for a price. And then you could get what you wanted in politically. So it was a system. You got it? In fact, Matthew one time calls the scribe a lawyer. Luke uses that word again and again and again. So the scribe was a powerful individual. Again, the first scribe probably was Ezra back in Nehemiah chapter 8. When they came out of the Babylonian captivity, they rediscovered the law. But then, once you've rediscovered the law, somebody's got to interpret the law. Who's going to do that? The scribe. So the scribe became, his reputation, his position, it built for 400 years until you come to the time of Jesus, and he is really, really a strong, influential person. Now, in our passage, in verse 20, he's linked with the Pharisee, who again can trace his origin clear back to Ezra and Nehemiah in Nehemiah chapter 8. They've come out of the Babylonian captivity. They've been there for 70 years. They've come back. They're rebuilding the walls, setting up the temple. They rediscover the law of God. They bring the people in. Ezra the scribe, Nehemiah the prophet, gather together, and they call the people in, and every morning from the crack of dawn till midday, they stand the entire time while the word of God, the law of God is proclaimed. They bow and commit themselves. It was during that time, and this is so significant, you really need to know this. This is so significant. During that time, they recognized the fact that the reason they got messed up and went off into Babylonian captivity was because they had rejected the law of God, neglected and rejected. So they said, we're never doing that again. So a special group of people began to build. Probably was small, took lots of years, but during that 400-year period, by the time you get to Jesus, you got that 400-year period, they have developed into an overwhelming strong group who have dedicated their, you got to admire them, they've dedicated their entire life function to the study of the law and the keeping of the law so they never get messed up again. And they are the people who are pounding the idea of the law. They are the people who are saying, hey, we're going to hold it high. We're going to preach every sermon on it. It's going to be in all of our political rallies. We are going to hold the banner high. We're going to push people in the direction of. We're going to stress consistently the law, the law, the law. And they were the Pharisees. Now the Sadducees is a whole other group, and they're kind of liberal. But the Pharisees are the dedicated group who have given themselves to the absolute perfection and keeping of the law of God. Now, you realize that the Scriptures, and we've gone over this before, but the Scriptures is here, and what does that mean in our day? Scriptures, hey, it doesn't say anything about television, it says nothing about iPads, it says nothing about internet. So how do I apply the Scriptures to that? So even in their day, it had been so long since the Scriptures had been written, they had to make application. So they developed 613 oral interpretations of what this means. Which was, we've been pounding that. It's very, very significant. So they had given themselves, and these Pharisees and scribes were the ones that pushed this 613 oral interpretation and said, oh, this really matters. Here's what the law means. This is what you got to do. Here's what you got to carry out. And they had constant conflict with Jesus over this stuff. Last night we've been dealing on Saturday night with chapter 12. And in chapter 12 you've got it highlighted. They're dealing with, the disciples have picked grain on the Sabbath day. You cannot do that. You should not do that. What are you doing? And they're all bent out of shape. And Jesus just blows it off like, nobody cares. Get on with the program. Eat away. Have a big time. Well, that's so upsetting to a Pharisee who's dedicated his whole law to the law. And it's saying, listen, we got to keep the standard straight. We got to keep it high. Man, if you lower the standard, who knows? The next thing you know, they'll be taking drugs. And you want to applaud them and say, yay, go for it, boy. Because they want to keep the standard high. So the Sabbath day was one of the strong issues of that. And Jesus just seemed to, and then they went to the temple and he did a medical procedure on the Sabbath day. What? Could have waited till Monday. The guy wasn't going to die. Why didn't Jesus just wait? But it was like he didn't care. So you have this overwhelming controversy going on between the Pharisees, who are absolutely dedicated to the law of God, 613 oral interpretation, over against Jesus, who's just... So there's a major conflict taking place. The divorce issue was brought up. In fact, you can read about it in Matthew 19. They brought up the issue of divorce. I think it's absolutely mind-boggling that for 2,000, you realize that was 2,000 years ago when they did that. Do you realize we've been arguing about divorce for 2,000 years? And nobody's settled it yet. And the school of Hillel says, here's the reason you should divorce your wife. And Shammai says, no, here's the reason and only grounds for divorce. And we've been debating that thing for 2,000. That's a long-standing issue. And we're still arguing about it. And it was all wrapped up in these 613 oral interpretations, and the Pharisees are really hot about this. Contained in this whole thing is the defilement idea. That there are sinners around town, you know. Bad people. And you know what happens? They walk around and, I don't know, they stir up dust, and that dust has touched them and it's defiled. Then it gets on you and, ooh, you're defiled. So you've got to go through baptism and washings, and man, they had them by the dozen. And then Jesus came and his disciples, and they're supposed to go through this cleansing of their hands before to get rid of all this defilement of the Gentiles. It just makes your skin crawl to think about it. And they're to go through all of this, and Jesus just blows it off. Like, and they're upset. Don't keep the defilement laws. They don't walk as they should. And again, you've got to admire them and say, these guys are totally dedicated. They've given themselves to the law. They've given themselves to holding the standard high. They've given themselves to preserving the temple and a way of life. They've given themselves to God Jehovah and the strictness of that of a holy God. Come on, man. And Jesus, you're just like it doesn't matter. What's the deal? Now, to show you how dedicated they were to all of this, they could tolerate the Sadducees, who were a little loose and would compromise in order because they were more materialistic. So they would the Sadducees would compromise, and the Pharisees were upset about it, but they would tolerate the Sadducees, who weren't as strict as they were, and they could put up with that, but they could not put up with Jesus. And they were so stirred up about this, they were so moved about this, that they went to the conference room and plotted murder. We've got to get rid of him because he's threatening everything we believe in. He's threatening the very structure of what we're all about. And if he has his way, and besides that, his popularity is growing, it's those miracles, free food, that'll get him every time. Scribes, Pharisees. Interesting. Jesus comes along in verse 20 and says, there's a contrast, obviously. What's the contrast? For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribe and the Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Sets up a contrast. Over here's the righteousness of the scribe and Pharisee. Over here's the righteousness of the kingdom of God. And obviously there is a contrast. If your righteousness doesn't go way beyond, exceed the righteousness of the scribe and the Pharisees, you cannot be in the kingdom of heaven. Now, understand, it's not just, well, yeah, I've been a Christian for 50 years in the kingdom and my righteousness has been getting greater, and so it's finally above. No, you don't even get in. In other words, the beginning step. In other words, the bottom line. In other words, the bottom rung, where you start in the kingdom of heaven, is bigger and greater and way beyond the righteousness of the scribe and the Pharisee. Contrast. So, what is the difference between them? We ought to know that, hadn't we? Now, just to remind you, kingdom of heaven, what the kingdom of heaven is. It takes you back to the Beatitudes because this is a playoff of all of that. The Beatitudes started out with, oh, you're poor in spirit, which was absolute destitution, which was absolute helplessness. So, in your absolute helplessness, here you are. You're mourning over that, second Beatitude. You're mourning over that. You embrace your helplessness, which allows his overwhelming resource to come and to embrace you. And in the embrace of your helplessness and his overwhelming significant person, you literally become the kingdom. In other words, the kingdom is not a location into which you go. The kingdom is, the very essence of his presence and the embrace of his person. And in that embrace, the two of you become a new creature called the kingdom of heaven. So the kingdom is not something you do. the kingdom is a relationship. Now, you got to put that into the context of what he's saying and the difference in verse 20. In other words, when he's talking about righteousness of the scribe and the Pharisee over against the righteousness of entering the kingdom, he's not talking the same. Two of you got it. Good. What is the difference? Now, what we're going to do is we're going to begin to march into verse 21 down through verse 48 and some of the rest of the Sermon on the Mount as well. We're not going to get into any detail. We will do that. Trust me. We will do that. That will be coming up eventually. But there's no way to interpret verse 20 and get into verse 20 without getting into the flow of what follows, because that's the whole explanation of it. So we're going to touch on that a little bit. So what we're dealing with is in verse 20, hey, the righteousness of the scribe and the Pharisee, you've got to exceed that if you're going to be in the kingdom. Well, what's the difference between the two? Number one, cosmetic. Oh, you ladies will love this. Cosmetics. See, the righteousness of the Pharisee and the scribe was all what? Cosmetics. It was all about what? How do you look? It was all about performance. In fact, to tell you how strong this was, you can imagine the crowd that Jesus was talking to. When he would stand up and look at this crowd, actually was sitting, and look at this crowd and say, hey, your righteousness has got to exceed the righteousness of the scribe and the Pharisee, or you can't even get into the kingdom. They must have looked at him and said, what? That's absolutely impossible. Because you could not do more things than the Pharisee did. Be impossible. For instance, take the issue of tithing. Tithing in the Old Testament is 10%. 10% of your gross. So here's 10%. Well, if you tithe 10%, how are you going to do more than tithe? Well, you could give offerings, but you wouldn't do more than tithe. You tithe, you tithe. Tithe is tithe. They were so meticulous about this, as I've said to you before, that they had this little herb plant out back, and they would go out back, and when they pick an herb to use for their dinner, it would be about the size of the end of your finger or a pea, and they would take a knife and slice off 10%. That beats anything you've ever done in your whole life. They even tied their herbs. Now, how are you going to beat that? Let's talk the feast days. The feast days, they kept all the feast days. It was their deal. I mean, they were meticulous about it. They were where they were supposed to be, and they did what they were supposed to do in the feast days. I mean, come on. How are you going to go to church more than every time the church doors are open? Unless you're like some of us and you move in. I mean, come on. If the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, I got to be more righteous than that. How can I go to church more than every time the church doors are open? How can I tithe more than down to the very herb in my backyard? In terms of entertainment and involvement in that realm, good night. How can I do? I don't have a TV. I don't go to movies. I don't watch videos. All I do is read the Bible. How are you going to? See, there's no way I can. How can I meet the hour of prayer? How can I pray more than just the hours of prayer? They're all set up for me. There's the fasting time, which are all established. We've been doing for years. And every time I'm supposed to fast, I fast. And every time I'm supposed to be in prayer, I'm in prayer. And man, I get up at 3 a.m. and I pray for 3 hours and I pray for you. So wow, how can I do any more than that? And then Jesus, you come along and say, that's nothing. You got to go way beyond that or you don't even get in. That, my friend, is ridiculous. Evidently, something is going on in the mind of Jesus that isn't going on in the mind of the scribes and Pharisees. Obviously, Jesus' approach to this whole thing, his focus is altogether different. And it's not that complicated, because as you get into the rest of the chapter, what do you find out? Oh, Jesus' focus is internal, not external. Just let it soak. It's internal, not external. That what Jesus was all wrapped up in was what was going on inside of you, rather than what's outside of you. And the reason for that, it's all over the scriptures. The reason for that is because he knew that what was inside of you would show up outside. And that was the problem all along anyway. So he was constantly dealing with inside stuff. And the Pharisees hated it because their whole righteousness was based on outside activity stuff. And folks, if I would have been born 2,000 years ago, I would have been a wonderful Pharisee. Because I love that stuff. And one of the reasons I love it is because it gives me a basis to judge you. Because you don't do as well as I do. And Jesus really went after that. Let me give you some examples. Verse 21. You have heard it said by them of old, you shall not murder. Oh, that's external. Absolutely. Whole standard was what? Don't murder. Hey, I don't. Don't kill anybody. I don't. Don't slaughter anybody. I don't. Don't run them over with your car. I try not to. There are accidents, but I try not to. Unless they're teenagers. I try not to. I try not to. Jesus said, come on, you got to go beyond that. Well, how could you go beyond that? You either kill or you don't kill. You either murder or you don't murder. I got that down. I don't murder. I've never murdered. I'm not going to murder. I don't murder people. I just don't. Hey, I don't murder people. That's the end of that. So how can I go beyond that? Well, he took it and internalized it. Look at this. Verse 22. I say to you, whoever is angry. Whoa, whoa, whoa. What's that like? Mad. What's that like? Hate. What is he saying? Well, the reason I do the outside activity of murder is that inside, I never murder anybody I love. A guy's writing out a check for $50,000 and he's going to give it to me. I don't kill him. I wrap my arm around him, buy him a cup of coffee. Who do you murder? People you hate. So the outside deed is all about what? The inside thing. So he took the outside, yes, you do, you don't do, you don't murder, you don't, yeah, but you do, you put their picture on a wall, you get a shotgun and blow their stinking head off. You think about how you're going to do it, you tie the noose real tight, and you dream about around their neck. You see their tongue sticking out. You dream those dreams at night, yes. You plot, you plan. You never do it. No, well, that's okay in their mind. That was their righteousness. Jesus said, I want to do something so dynamic in you that you don't even hate. Well, that's an extreme impossibility, right? Now, surface-wise, we all believe this. And the reason I know that is because all my life around the church you've taught me, you got to love me if you want to go to heaven, which isn't true. I can love you and go straight to hell. But anyhow, that's what you taught me. That's what you taught me. You got to love me if you want to go to heaven. So I know I'm supposed to love everybody, but you can't love everybody, but I got to love everybody, but I can't love everybody, but I'm supposed to love everybody. So what? I'm working on it. So we got the bite your lip kind of love. We got the strain kind of love. We got the tolerate kind of love. See, I can tolerate you. Just about 2 hours every week. Why do you think I leave town? Because my wife can't tolerate me. So what? See, no, he's not talking tolerate. See, the whole standard is impossible. See, I can buy into the Pharisee thing, don't murder. I can get that done. But the whole idea of don't hate, don't anger, how are you going to get that done? Oh, that's the Sermon on the Mount. I can't get that done. Here's my absolute helplessness. I'm totally destitute. I know I should love, but I can't love. I got these feelings. I can't help the way I feel. Do you realize there are mean people around? And there are people who've hurt me. And they've done nasty things to me. How on earth am I going to have? Not kill them. I can pull that off. Oh, but I'm helpless. And in my helplessness, he comes. And in that involvement of his person, something so beautiful happens. See, this is not you need to love people. See, this is come on, folks. Let's get deeper with him. Come on, people. Let's become more intimate with him. Come on, folks. Let's get more involved with him. Oh, come on, people. Let's just be filled with him. Let's just, be saturated with the very essence of who he is and let him do something so deep within us that all this stuff that we really don't want there anyhow is cleansed and filled with him. And whoa. Let me give you another one. Spend way too much time on this. Sorry. Look at verse 27. These are the words of Jesus. I would never get into this. I would bypass this one for sure. This is way too personal. You have heard that it was said to them of old, you shall not commit adultery. I've never cheated on my wife. Listen, I've been all over the country in motels by myself. I've had lots of, some opportunity. And I've never cheated on my wife. Wanted to. Wish that I could. Got online. But I never cheated. Pharisee said, nearly broke my arm. See, that was great. What did Jesus say? What did he say this for? I say to you, next verse, that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. That's weird. Isn't that weird? Because obviously the physical activity, let's just talk about the murder thing. The murder, is he talking about, here's what we've done. See if you can get a hold of this. I'm not sure I've got a hold of it, but see if you can. He's not talking about taking the outside law, which was don't murder, and bringing it inside and now making it don't hate. Because that would still be external. It would be taking external standards and imposing it upon internal feelings, which is the same dynamic. And I can't really pull that off, so somehow I got to compromise on this. See, if you're saying outside, don't commit adultery, I don't. Now take that and bring it inside, don't commit adultery inside either. How am I going to pull that off? That's not what he's talking about. What he's talking about, oh, come on. Look like you're getting this. What he's talking about is, he's talking about the very idea, the very concept, the very, what's the word? Philosophy, the very perspective you have of womanhood. How do you view women? Or women, how do you view men? So he's taken the thing way beyond just some physical act to a very thought process. Well, how should I view women? I have no idea. Well, how could I find out? Oh, I'm totally helpless. I'm going to have to get a hold of him, and he's going to have to come, and he's going to have to indwell me. And as I get into him and I get his mind, I'm going to take on the viewpoint of womanhood through his eyes. So this is not, oh, this coming Saturday, we're going to have a seminar on right perspective of womanhood. And you could take the class and make an A, and you wouldn't pull this off. Because this is not about developing a right philosophy. This is about him, you, him, and the coming together. Does that make any sense to you? The coming together until your insides begin to respond to womanhood as he responds to them, and why he made women in the first place, and why we lack one rib. And people, only he can get that done. So this is not before the mirror. Ooh, little blemish there. Ooh, blemish there. Good night, what a blemish. We're not dealing with that. Not cosmetic stuff. We're dealing with an inside relationship with the intimacy and oneness of the person of Jesus literally coming into my life until I develop his perspective, both on how I treat my brother and also on how I treat women. He says, and this just goes on and on, but he says, go for instance down to verse 33. In verse 33 he said, again you've heard that it was said to them of old, you shall not swear falsely, and you shall perform your oaths to the Lord. Oh, yes. When I have an oath to the Lord, I have to perform it. I have to do what I say I'm going to do. Now, why didn't you do that? You said you were going to do that, and you didn't do it. I didn't swear by the Bible. So if I don't have my hand on the Bible, I can rip you off. And then they, in the 613 oral tradition, they began to develop into what you swear by and how binding that what you swear by is. And he goes into that. Some say, oh, I didn't swear by the altar, therefore I don't have to. I just swore by the temple, and I did swear by the altar. I didn't have my hand on the Bible. I had my hand on the Quran, and I don't have to do it if it's on the Quran. Jesus said, what? Why don't you just be honest? Why don't you just let your yea be yea and your nay be nay? Why don't you just be a person of integrity? And keep your word. Well, I mean to, but I get in binds. You know, there's a lot of pressure. And I intended to, but wow, got in this, and things happened. It was easier not to, so I can't pull that off. I know. I'm totally helpless. But what would happen if he would go? So see, this is not, okay, I'll meet up to the standard. I'll start always telling the truth. No, it's not that. Because that would be just like the Pharisees, only. So we're talking about an internal nature change that literally does something, and you can walk through this whole chapter that way. An internal nature change that does something so deep within your life that literally you begin to take on his mind. You begin to think like he thinks. You have his perspective. You begin to see your fellow man in terms of, and all the hurts they do to you through his mind and how he and his redemptive process. You see womanhood through his creativeness as he created man and woman and put them together. You see his character, his integrity, and what he wants, and you begin to, so this is, whoa, people. You know what we got a hold of here? We got a hold of a chance to go way beyond the rights and wrongs, do's and don'ts. Can I, can't I, where do I, don't I? Whoa, we got a chance to move into an intimacy with the divine God that does something in the hearts of our minds and our inner beings that literally transform the whole flow of our living, from how we treat our brother to our sexuality, to our honesty, to our... all in this intimacy. I want that. I want that. I want that. Oh, Jesus. You drive us constantly, don't you, back to yourself. You bring us consistently, you pull us in constantly to who you are, and are we going to turn you loose in our life? And are we going to embrace you? Are we going to let you embrace us? And are you, the living God, going to be able to live within us and begin to flow in our minds and our hearts and be in us what you want to be? And you know how we are, God. We're so legalistic, and we love the Pharisee thing. And Lord, it's so easy to set up rules, and this is the way it is. And we usually what we do, God, I'm so guilty of this. Usually what I do, God, is I really talk loud and long about the things that don't bother me, the rules that don't bother me, that I can easily keep because they're no issue for me. And I excuse myself and downplay and eliminate the ones that bother me. See, it's really easy for me to stand up here and be overweight and yell at people who smoke cigarettes. That's really easy, Lord. Because cigarettes don't bother me. And God, we're all guilty of that. We have judged each other on things that didn't bother us. But we didn't talk about the things that we had struggles with. God, would you take all that out of me? And in the realm of preaching, Jesus, I don't want to yell and scream at people about stuff that wag my finger in their face about things that and never preach on the stuff that really gets to me. And could we be a people, God, who are committed to the truth, and you are the truth? And instead of having a bunch of stars around here and Pharisees who are super righteous and the rest of us are struggling to be, could we just all lay our lives at your feet? Could you just do something in all of us? And we'd spend all of our time just giving you praise? And could we find that all the barriers are down and all the judgments about each other are gone, and none of us are too hot, but you are something. And the only good in any of us is you. And that we are a people who are opening ourselves to you, that you might embrace us today. So, Lord, I'd like to be the one that kicks it off. I'd like to kneel this morning and say to you, here's something going on in my life that I don't like. And I want you to get in the middle of it. And I know it's not in biting my lip and trying harder and get my act together and figure it out. I know it's in yielding and surrendering. And in the saturation of your presence in my life, I've got a shot at being different. Being different. Heads are bowed. I don't know what you got going on. I don't know what you're struggling with. Don't struggle. Come on, don't struggle. Would you yield? Would you embrace? Would you let him flow in your life? Would you let him give you his perspective, how he feels? Would you let him father you, grow you, change you? Would you come out of struggle into relaxation? Would you come out of the Pharisee try, bite your lips, finally be satisfied with some external cosmetic thing when he wants to make an inner beauty in you that will shine through your whole life? So whatever you're struggling with, whatever you're up against, whatever you're feeling, would you embrace him with it? Altars open. Be obedient. Moments of seeking.